Welcome to Mooney Reads. Today I have a standalone book review. I don't tend to do a whole lot of these, but I'm wanting to make an effort to do more of them, especially for the books that are a part of my kind of directed study, DIY class thing that I'm trying to do. I've got a whole video on that if you're interested. But the book that I'm going to be talking about today is What's Your Pronoun? Beyond He and She by Dennis Barron. This I read for the directed study that I'm trying to do on queerness and kind of global issues and language, sort of where those things kind of intersect. And I'm glad that I read this early on because this is much more about the linguistics. And I had just been watching a lot of kind of 101 refresher lectures on language and linguistics. So this definitely has a lot of information on the history of pronouns. I think that's its strongest suit is historical. It is kind of borderline repetitive, which I didn't really mind in the beginning especially. A lot of the stuff that I hadn't heard of before was when the author was discussing stuff from the late 1800s, early 1900s, and what the pronoun discourse looked like then, as well as the third pronouns that were being suggested. However, kind of the later half of the book is where I kind of have more critiques. So, to kind of do a thorough discussion of this book, I'm going to go through each chapter, talk a little bit about it, and then at the end I have a few kind of big points of contention or critique that I wanted to talk about. This starts out with a chapter entitled The Missing Word. So this chapter starts out with kind of a discussion of sort of what pronouns look like currently, how people are talking about it in public discourse, how it's important. And then after that goes on to talk about what even are the options when we're looking to find a pronoun that's not gender specific, whether we're talking about just a person who's hypothetical or who we don't know the gender of, or kind of as a third option for people. This chapter, I think, was a good brief summary, definitely not anything super in-depth in terms of like all the angles of pronoun discourse or what have you. I personally thought it was interesting and kind of jarring to see one of the examples that he brings up, which is the University of Tennessee in Knoxville got defunded because of a newsletter that they put out that had a section of it talking about asking students about pronouns and giving, guidance on this is how you use these neopronouns. I remember when that happened and was actually an officer in an LGBT group at a different school in Tennessee when this happened. And I remember going to Knoxville Pride in 2016 as sort of support. And this defunding wasn't something within the school, like the school was upset about the newsletter. This was the state. The state defunded the whole diversity department. I forget if it was for a year or a couple of years, but I know that they had a lot of problems funding their Pride Center because of that, but that wasn't the only thing affected. So that's interesting on a personal note, but I also think that it's a good example of just how intense the sort of discussion is. This was published in 2020, so this was before everything that we're seeing now with the Don't Say Gay bills and just the litany of other just really homophobic and transphobic legislation in the South especially, but not only. So this was, I think, a good example for him to bring up that kind of shows where the issues are or where they're going. In chapter 2, he talks about the option of he as a gender-neutral pronoun. So the assumption of, if you don't know who it is, just using he as a default. And he specifically looks at it on a political level, looking at women's suffrage a whole lot, especially because this is around the time that the discourse around alternatives comes around or sort of begins around women's suffrage, which is why a lot of this talks about the late 1800s and early 1900s. He also brings up examples from other sorts of legislation. So he gives examples of people who tried to get out of crimes by looking at the law and how it's legislated in regard to pronouns, questioning the gender-neutral he. People have also second-guessed female politicians because of this, because everything is put in terms of he. So he talks about all of this, and it's sort of setting the scene to talk about the alternatives, because that was what people did, what people used, but it was clearly impacting people in a very real way with a lot of these legal discussions that were going on. There's also a little bit of discussion of the general she as well, which didn't happen in a lot of situations, mostly in situations where people were assumed to be women. One of the examples that I remember is talking about teachers, some policies regarding teachers, and she was used, and some of the male teachers were upset about it, which gets brought up. And it's interesting, kind of looking when they're talking about stuff in this chapter, in the following chapter, including that example that I gave of the general she, there's a lot of vitriol towards women's rights activists and suffragists because of, basically because they've pointed out the problem with the general he, or like wanting to get rights that some of these things are gatekept with, or, you know, you'll see going through all of these laws and how it's legislated, it's kind of clear that where it's convenient, judges, you know, will say one way or another, oh, well, this pertains to only men, or obviously this pertains to everyone. Which is not surprising looking at the way that a lot of other things have been legislated in the past, which I don't want to get too far into, because that is one of, I think, my big gripes with the book, is that it kind of looks at this issue in isolation. It looks at gender in isolation, when there is a lot more to dig into if you're wanting to look at the politics of certain words and things like that. The third chapter is all about words that failed. So he goes through and talks about just the litany of suggested words, which this is where we get to the point where it's repetitive. There are a lot of suggested pronouns, and he talks about this even in the intro. There are over 200, the earliest being suggested, I think, in the 1770s. And so there's a lot to go on, but a lot of it is focused in around this discussion of women's suffrage and the need to kind of go away from the general he. I think the reason why I was enjoying kind of the repetition here is just because it was so interesting to see how all of these people were saying sort of the same things, which I think on one hand you can't fault them for completely, because the availability of information is not what it was today, but it's just still very funny to see people suggest the same thing at different times. It's also interesting seeing some of the people who suggested the pronoun, who were still very angry, like they're suggesting some of these things out of spite for the women who have made the general he no longer valid. That's not all of them. Some people are genuinely interested in the grammatical challenge. There are some people that are doing it in a supportive way, but there's also a really large section of the discourse that is not favorable. And there are also a lot of people who are in opposition to these, who are, again, a lot of the opposition is very much misogynistic, but it's also interesting because the majority of the examples that are given are of men suggesting this. So it's not women's suffragists, not that none of them did, because there certainly were women who suggested it, but the overwhelming amount, at least, I don't know what his numbers are, because he didn't give that sort of percentage, I don't think, in here, but it seemed like a lot of the people who were suggesting alternative pronouns were men. After that chapter, we go into queering the pronoun, and in this chapter, he is looking at basically where queer people come in, because up until this point, we were talking about a third pronoun on a grammatical level or on a women's rights level, like not being androcentric and only using he. And in this chapter, we're looking more at queer people, where queer people start to be discussed a little bit more. He gives examples like the public universal friend of people who defied sort of gender binaries and also were suggesting using other pronouns for themselves. For those who don't know, the public universal friend was a Quaker person who lived in the 1800s and woke up one day out of a fever saying that they only wanted to be called public universal friend, and instead of using feminine she/her pronouns, he wanted to be referred to as he, and was kind of a very androgynous figure. And alongside him, they also brought up Orlando, the book Orlando by Virginia Woolf. And then also language alongside all of this. So there's a small amount on language around trans people and intersex people before going into current, not just discourse, but the need to talk about pronouns, not just third pronouns, but pronouns and gender more widely. So looking at trans people in prisons, looking at how schools treat trans people, and just generally current usage of pronouns. So going into what I've heard most people, or a lot of people in online discourses, called neopronouns, which he doesn't really use the word neopronouns in all of this. It's just like invented pronouns, novel pronouns, that sort of thing. But for the sake of this video, when I'm saying neopronouns, I associate those with new pronouns contemporarily that people have come up with, largely to talk about self-identification. So just as a little aside, that's what I mean when I say neopronoun. But it's not necessarily something that he uses, and may not really be an official definition, but it's our working definition here. And that brings us to the final chapter. The missing word is they. And as the title says, this is kind of where he tries to wrap up the whole thing in saying that this kind of search for a third pronoun is, not really, it's interesting, but the answer has been there all along. And he begins by talking about the oldest case that they found, written down, where people have used they in a singular way. And that was in Middle English. The example that he has was in Middle English, which is very, very old. Older than singular you. And he talks about that for a while, and I thought that was very interesting. So singular they has been around longer than singular you, and then he argues that singular they kind of should be the thing that people are leaning on more, rather than looking into these kind of new pronouns. That's kind of how he wraps it up. So good things about this. I liked a lot of the historical information. I learned a lot of new things. When he's looking at stuff from a historical perspective, I think it's pretty good. A little repetitive, but I didn't mind because I am interested in the information. However, there were some things that I kind of took issue with. Now, I will say with all of these, I do understand that this person is probably, researching very much this specific, looking at historical pronoun usage. So that is what they have an abundance of knowledge about. That is why they have, gone out and meticulously found over 200 pronouns. There's a whole chapter where he sets up the timeline, which is also really cool to see. Which that kind of functioned more as an appendix than a chapter to me. But that's neither here nor there. I'm glad it was included. So I understand that that is going to be more rigorous and more well written than some of the other things. But there are a couple of things that I really feel that there should have been kind of more research, at least from, he didn't have to go out and reinvent the wheel, but rather bringing in other sources would have really improved a lot of what he was doing. And it's in about 2 major areas. I'll probably end up expanding one of them into more than one just because I have kind of a lot of thoughts going in my head. One is about how he talks about the law and the way that law is interpreted. And really that's around issues that weren't brought up that I feel are important to bring up when we're talking about this sort of thing. And then the other one has to do with a lot of the later half of the book and the way that he talks about neopronouns and the conclusion that he comes to, which I don't even totally disagree with his conclusion, but I have a really big bone to pick with a lot of how he talks around it and the things that he doesn't kind of distinguish around it. Point number 1, looking at law. This was a really interesting look into how law was interpreted in regards to pronouns. And he also talks about how there was a law that said that pronouns, he would be assumed to mean everyone unless he referred back to something that was gendered. So if there was a man or a gentleman or anything like that, it could be interpreted to mean males, which is why I think there was so much back and forth and still a lot of room for interpretation. And then he goes into these different examples of people having different outcomes in regards to the law because of that. And I thought it was weird to have this discussion and not even mention other legal things that were being legislated the same type of way. If you look back at how race is legislated, created, recreated in American law, there is an incredible just amount of information on that. And while this book isn't talking about race at all, like that's not its main thing, when we're talking about American law, I feel like it's something that needs to at the very least be mentioned. I think that for this particular book, acknowledging this would give us a bigger picture at what the American legal system looks like, or basically situate this kind of legal pronoun discussion in with what else is going on legally. And I think this is super pertinent, especially, we're looking at sexism or misogyny, but we're looking at it among white people. Like, we talk about women's suffrage without talking about voting rights more widely, which is a choice. A lot of this particular pronoun discourse is also very much mostly affecting white people. There is no kind of recognition of any of that, despite the fact that we're talking about women's suffrage. And there was a lot going on in regards to race with that sort of movement. But that's all I'll say on that point. Going into my second point was looking at how he handled neopronouns. He did have some discussion about modern pronoun usage, and in particular kind of like legal ramifications or like legal things around pronouns. However, I don't think that he really, from what I can see from this book, understands or has really studied neopronoun usage. He does talk about it. He does talk about how people are using these particular new pronouns for self-identification purposes or for, to communicate something about themselves for people to use for them. And he gives some statistics of a couple of studies saying how many people actually use neopronouns. But there's not a whole lot of care, or there's not a whole lot that actually talks a lot about why people use different pronouns. Like, he does bring up different kinds of, like, contemporary neopronouns and instances where they've been brought up, but not much about actual usage, why people choose to use them, and I think that's very reflected in his final chapter. So his final conclusion is that they has been here the whole time, it's been used the whole time, that is the pronoun that's the pronoun you've been looking for. And I don't disagree that I think that they is what people are going to use as a default gender neutral pronoun. It is what they do use. I think it is descriptive to say that people use the word they. And I think that with all of the stuff that he provided here, you could see the difficulty in actually having a gender neutral, like, third alternative. It's difficult to catch on. A few of them did, but not very strongly. It was enough to be included in a crossword puzzle, but not enough to be used every day. However, I take some issue with how he talked about them, especially in regards to, like, things being political. And I think this goes into a deeper issue that I have with more of what he was saying, which I guess would be another point in and of itself. I'm going to read this small section from it, and I think this kind of gets at some of my issue of this part of the book. On page 181, he says, "But invented pronouns have drawbacks too. They are high profile, calling attention to trans and non-binary rights. Yes, I've just labeled that as a strength, but as Thomas Lounsbury pointed out more than 100 years ago, focusing on a gender issue may distract from other aspects of a speaker's message, especially if nothing else in the message is gender-related. Politically charged language may also draw a negative response, and that too can be a plus or minus. Sometimes speakers want to get their audience a little bit annoyed or uncomfortable, hoping to raise consciousness, but sometimes the same language politics can shut out the possibility of discourse and defeat the aim of communication. Another thing about invented pronouns, their usefulness may be time limited. For now, they highlight gender issues, but as gender nonconformity becomes increasingly accepted, it will also become less noticeable, rendering the high-profile invented pronouns less necessary." In all of this, on one hand, I could see people being more confused about new pronouns, transphobes being more irritated by them, and some people kind of centering some of the political message. And I don't doubt that people who use neopronouns get more shit than people who use they, them. He goes on to say on the next page that they, them is less political, and even people who say they don't like pronouns actually use they, them. But I disagree with the idea that they, them is, like, non-political and a novel pronoun is political. I feel like it's a partial truth, and he's kind of, like, not, when you're talking about an individual's, like, identity, like using pronouns to refer to a specific person rather than just using it as a general pronoun for someone that you don't know anyone about, it's going to be politically charged to transphobes, you know, regardless of which thing you use. You know, people who hate non-binary people are going to think that it's annoying whether you use they, them, or ze, them. And that's not something that I think is really acknowledged in full enough, which brings me to my kind of larger problem with some of this kind of politically. You know, he spends a lot of time talking about how around the time of women's suffrage, people were really talking about pronouns, and that was, like, a center of the political discourse, and that's similar to now. So, like, pronouns have been a thing that people have talked about for a long time, and it's been in the middle of the political discourse. But it kind of stops there. Just the fact that it's been a part of the political discourse. But I think that there's so much more that we could look into. And I think that it requires a level of nuance that's maybe not, available in a 200-page book that's taking on this much. But in the book, he talks about the existence of pronouns in popular discourse, in political discussions, but he doesn't take it any further than that. He doesn't look into maybe why this is focused on. He doesn't really acknowledge, I think, too much who is talking about it, which I thought was kind of weird, especially because I thought of so much while I was reading this. And I think it's important to talk about that in both of these cases, there are multiple camps of people talking about these pronouns. In women's suffrage, you have people who are talking about how these pronouns are impacting their everyday life, how they affect how the laws treat them, and how they affect, how people might be thinking when you have, androcentrism like at the center of the language. Those are not most of the people that were talked about in this. A lot of the people who were having these discussions about pronouns were reacting not just to pronoun discussions, they were reacting to women's rights. Just like in modern day, there are people who are talking about pronouns and how they impact them, in very real ways, how they impact them, like legally, how they impact them interpersonally. And then you have people who are talking about pronouns in public discourse who are responding to trans rights. So we're not really talking about language here. They are talking about language because it is the easiest thing to get mad at without thinking, I think, about it too complexly. Or if they get, if somebody says, well, this is misogynistic, this is transphobic. Oh, well, I'm talking about English, they suddenly really care about the sanctity of the language. So I think that while he draws these parallels in this book, he doesn't go far enough with them. He doesn't really talk at length about what they're really getting at. And I feel like you could have a conversation from there further on, whether it's about the nature of discourse politically or about reactions to human rights. So there was just, I feel like, a really big hole and a lot of potential for the issue that this book brings up that it just doesn't really approach with any depth. Like, I was kind of surprised that, you spent so much time talking about public discourse, you draw the lines, and then you go back to talking about language. And that's especially weird, or makes it at least more weird to me, because, again, you're not really looking at current neo-pronoun usage outside of, how many people use them. There's no why, which I should have said this earlier on. I think, more inclined to think of that specific whole just because my master's thesis was on LGBT language usage, specifically for trans and non-binary people, and pronouns were a part of that. So that is literally my niche, so of course I would notice when it's missing. But even so, I do think that it should have been acknowledged on a deeper level, because I think that with the way that he wrote this conclusion, there's this assumption that people are using neopronouns to make visible a political point, which is not always true. Can be true, isn't always true. And again, circling back to the point which I'm not even trying to properly address the first time I really brought this up, but in that quote, he says that basically, gender nonconformity is eventually going to be a non-issue. And that's a really bold statement to make, especially, this was written in 2020, and the backlash to queer people has been more intense, not less intense. And it's also, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding of queerness. The point isn't like assimilation. So certainly you would hope that being different would not be stigmatized. But the ways that people express themselves, we don't want to go away. And these neopronouns are sort of a part of that. And I think that's something that's just missed. So to summarize, What's Your Pronoun had a lot of good information about the history of gender neutral pronouns, especially around the 18 and 1900s. But I took a lot of issue with its political prerogative or lack thereof, and how he discussed novel neopronouns or contemporary neopronouns. And overall, I think I would recommend it to people who are interested in the history of the English language and are already sort of invested. I'm not sure that I would recommend this to people who are just looking to get into nonfiction because it is kind of repetitive. And the beginning part, I really liked. The end part, when it was more repetitive, when it went to the stuff that I already knew, it did get boring. So I don't think that it would be really compelling for someone who isn't super into nonfiction or this topic anyways. If you're looking for something on pronouns in regards to trans people, either understanding why people use certain pronouns or how to use pronouns, this is also not the book for it. It seems like it could be, just based on the cover. I was actually expecting it to talk more about trans people and pronouns than it did. But that's simply not what this book is about. It is perfectly respectful to trans people. They're included in the conversation, even if I don't think that some of it necessarily goes far enough. But there's nothing wrong with it in that regard. But if you have read this one, let me know what you thought about it in the comments. And if you have any other reading suggestions for me based on this book and what I said about it, also leave that as well. Thank you all so much for watching. Bye.